The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Cedar Grove Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. It was 9:15 a.m., and the courtroom hummed with nervous energy as people waited for their cases to be called. Among them sat Dr. Michelle Richardson, her dark hands folded neatly in her lap, watching as others presented their cases before the bench. Judge William Harrison, known for his stern demeanor and long tenure on the bench, was in full form this morning. At 62 years old, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he exuded the authority of a man who had spent 25 years presiding over cases, and his reputation had spread throughout the town of Cedar Grove. The people spoke in hushed tones about his harsh fines, particularly for certain areas of the town, the neighborhoods where working-class families and minorities made their homes. Dr. Richardson checked her watch again. She had not planned to spend her entire morning here, but the emergency surgery she had performed the night before had left her too tired to argue when an officer pulled her over for a rolling stop. As she sat in the courtroom, her crisp blue blazer and black pants giving off an air of professionalism, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. She was used to working long hours as a pediatric surgeon, but the injustice of being pulled over for a minor traffic violation felt unfair, especially given her occupation. The court clerk, Mrs. Peterson, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and graying hair, called out the next case, Dr. Michelle Richardson, traffic violation, rolling stop at the intersection of Maple and 4th. Michelle stood, smoothing her pants as she did. Several courthouse regulars noticed her presence, their eyes flicking to her as she made her way toward the front of the room. Officer Johnson, a patrolman in his 40s, straightened up slightly. He had seen Dr. Richardson before, in the hospital, when she treated his nephew for a broken arm at Cedar Grove Children's Hospital. There was a hint of recognition in his eyes, but he said nothing. As Michelle approached the bench, she maintained perfect posture, her head held high. Years of dealing with hospital boards and difficult situations had taught her the importance of presenting herself professionally, especially as a Black woman in a field and a courtroom dominated by others. She had learned early on that how you presented yourself, how you carried yourself, mattered, particularly when the odds were stacked against you. Judge Harrison did not look up from the papers before him as he flipped through the file. He read the details aloud, his voice flat, rolling stop at Maple and 4th. He barely acknowledged her presence as he continued. "How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Michelle replied, her voice steady and measured. "But I would like to explain the circumstances." Judge Harrison finally looked up, his pale blue eyes narrowing slightly as they met hers. His gaze was calculating, as though he were trying to determine her sincerity. "The court didn't ask for circumstances," he replied, cutting her off before she could explain. "How do you plead?" Michelle's eyes met his without wavering. "Guilty, Your Honor," she repeated, "but I would like to provide context." "Context won't change the fact that you endangered lives by ignoring traffic signs," Judge Harrison interrupted, his tone growing sharper. He barely paused as he glanced at his notes. "Next case." Several regular courthouse workers exchanged glances in the gallery. The scene unfolding before them felt familiar. Too familiar. Some of the other waiting defendants shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others watched with resignation. It was clear to them that this was yet another example of the judge's harsh treatment, especially when dealing with people who didn't fit the profile of those he typically showed leniency toward. Michelle stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for the judge to proceed. Mrs. Peterson, the court clerk, shuffled papers unnecessarily, perhaps trying to catch the judge's eye or distract him, but to no avail. Officer Johnson, standing a few feet behind Michelle, cleared his throat softly. He had seen Dr. Richardson at the hospital. He knew her reputation, knew the lives she had saved, including the children of several police officers. Yet there was something different about today. It wasn't just the usual routine. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting brighter light into the room. The shadows of the American flag near the judge's bench stretched across Michelle's face as she waited. In her mind, she could hear her husband, James's voice from earlier that morning. "Just pay the fine if you have to, honey. Some battles aren't worth fighting." But as she stood before Judge Harrison, Watching his dismissive handling of her case, she realized that this might be a battle worth fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever stood in this same spot, feeling the weight of prejudgment before justice. She was used to the harsh realities of the medical field, but this was different. This was about dignity and respect, two things that were too often denied to people like her. Judge Harrison, still focused on the papers before him, straightened in his chair, his cold eyes narrowing as he looked down at Dr. Richardson. The morning light made the silver in his hair shine, but his expression was devoid of warmth. He made a show of slowly picking up her file again, as if savoring the moment before speaking. "So, Dr. Richardson," he began, emphasizing her title again with a hint of doubt in his voice, "you were stopped at 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Rather late for a doctor to be out, isn't it?" Michelle took a deep breath. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice steady. "Your Honor, I was returning from an emergency surgery at Cedar Grove Children's Hospital. A 6-year-old boy needed immediate attention." Judge Harrison cut her off sharply, his voice rising slightly. "This court isn't interested in your personal schedule, Dr. Richardson. We're here to address your violation of traffic laws." Michelle's stomach tightened, but she maintained her composure. She was well aware of how her race and profession could influence perceptions in the courtroom, and she knew she had to stay calm if she wanted to stand any chance of being heard. Mrs. Peterson leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "Your Honor, if I may, Dr. Richardson's record shows no prior violations in 20 years of driving." Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, but that's not relevant to today's case," he said curtly. He turned back to Michelle, his expression hardening once again. "The officer's report states that you made a rolling stop at a clear stop sign. Do you deny this?" "No, Your Honor," Michelle replied calmly. "But I would like to explain that there was no other traffic at that hour, and I was responding to an urgent call from the hospital about my post-surgery patient who—" "Dr. Richardson." Judge Harrison interrupted again, his voice rising slightly. "Are you suggesting that medical professionals are above the law? That traffic rules don't apply when you decide they're inconvenient?" Michelle felt a flash of anger rise in her chest, but she kept it in check. This was not the time to let her emotions get the better of her. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "I respect the law greatly. I'm simply providing context." For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Officer Johnson shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for the judge to make his decision. Mrs. Peterson shuffled papers again, trying to break the silence. Michelle stood firm, her eyes never leaving the judge's face. She knew that, regardless of the outcome, this was a moment where her voice mattered, a moment where her dignity as a person, as a professional, as a Black woman, had to be asserted in the face of systemic bias. Judge Harrison's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned his gaze back to the papers in front of him. He paused, and for a split second, Michelle thought he might reconsider his harsh approach. But then he spoke, his voice cold and impersonal, as he read aloud, "The court will take this under advisement. You'll be notified of your fine, and any further actions in due course." As she turned to leave the bench, Michelle's heart remained heavy. She had fought this small battle, but the war for justice in this courtroom was far from over. The courtroom felt tense, its atmosphere thick with anticipation as the morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long, angled shadows over the polished wooden benches. Dr. Michelle Richardson sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for her case to be called. The steady hum of whispered voices around her only intensified the heavy silence of the room. It was 9:15 a.m., and the court was full of people awaiting their turn, their eyes occasionally glancing up at the imposing figure of Judge William Harrison, who sat perched at the front of the room. The judge's reputation preceded him. He was known for his harsh demeanor and his rigid interpretation of the law, particularly when it came to people he deemed unworthy of his leniency. At 62 years old, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Judge Harrison had spent 25 years presiding over cases in Cedar Grove Municipal Court. His voice was booming, and his expressions could freeze the blood of even the most seasoned defendants. People whispered in the gallery about his propensity for imposing steep fines, particularly in neighborhoods populated by working-class families and minorities. Dr. Richardson, however, remained focused. The emergency surgery she had performed the night before had drained her physically, but she knew this was not a battle she could afford to lose. She had been pulled over by Officer Johnson for a rolling stop at a seemingly empty intersection. She hadn't expected this morning to be spent in court, but here she was, dressed in her crisp blue blazer and black pants, patiently waiting as her case approached. As the minutes dragged on, Judge Harrison's mechanical approach to justice continued. Case after case passed before him, each met with the same formulaic efficiency: call, approach, plea, fine. The process was predictable and impersonal. But for Michelle, it was anything but ordinary. As a pediatric surgeon, she had dedicated her life to saving children, often working through exhaustion and under extreme pressure. Yet here she was, accused of a simple traffic violation in the same cold, bureaucratic system that didn't seem to care about her work or her circumstances. Finally, the clerk, Mrs. Peterson, called out her name. Dr. Michelle Richardson, traffic violation, rolling stop at the intersection of Maple and 4th. Michelle stood up, smoothing her pants and making her way toward the bench. Several courthouse regulars glanced up, recognizing her. Officer Johnson, a patrolman she had treated in the past at Cedar Grove Children's Hospital, gave her a slight nod. She had treated his nephew for a broken arm just last month. But despite their brief recognition, Michelle knew that this moment was about much more than personal connections. She had seen enough to understand how the system worked and how it often worked against those who didn't fit a particular mold. Judge Harrison remained hunched over his papers, his pen moving across the page as he muttered the details of her case. Rolling stop at Maple and 4th, he read aloud, his tone flat and dismissive. How do you plead? Guilty, Your Honor, Michelle responded evenly, trying to maintain her composure despite the rising tension in her chest. But I would like to explain the circumstances. The judge didn't look up. The court didn't ask for circumstances, he snapped, cutting her off before she could elaborate. His eyes stayed focused on the papers in front of him, as if he were too busy to entertain any explanation. How do you plead? I plead guilty, Your Honor, Michelle repeated, taking a breath. But I would like to provide context. Context won't change the fact that you endangered lives by ignoring traffic signs, Judge Harrison said, his voice growing colder. He turned his attention to the next case, not waiting for any further comments. Several of the regulars in the gallery exchanged knowing glances. This wasn't unusual. Judge Harrison's treatment of defendants often followed a clear pattern, one that left little room for compassion. Michelle stood quietly, feeling the weight of the room's judgment upon her. She could feel Officer Johnson's eyes on her, but he remained silent, unable or unwilling to intervene. Mrs. Peterson, the court clerk, shuffled some papers, perhaps nervously trying to break the tension that had settled over the room. As the minutes dragged on, Michelle's thoughts drifted to her patient from the previous night, the young boy who had needed emergency surgery, his parents' faces filled with relief when she told them their child would be okay. She thought about her husband, James, who was probably sitting at City Hall right now, unaware of the events unfolding in this courtroom. He had always encouraged her to avoid conflict, to pick her battles carefully. Just pay the fine, honey, he had said this morning. Some battles aren't worth fighting. But as she stood there, watching Judge Harrison's dismissive behavior, she knew that this was a battle that could not go unchallenged. The judge's next words cut through her thoughts. I see you were driving a rather expensive car, he said, flipping through the officer's report. A Mercedes-Benz, according to the officer's notes. He looked up at her over the rim of his glasses, his voice carrying a hint of disdain. Interesting choice for someone claiming to be a doctor in our community hospital. Michelle felt the heat rise in her cheeks. It was an uncomfortable jab, but she kept her face neutral. She had been in more difficult situations. This was nothing compared to the challenges she faced in the operating room. Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her voice steady. I've worked as a pediatric surgeon for 15 years. That will be enough, Judge Harrison snapped, cutting her off. He picked up his gavel, his knuckles whitening against the dark wood. "This court has heard sufficient evidence of your disregard for public safety laws." He pounded the gavel on the bench, a signal that the matter was all but decided. Just as the judge prepared to finalize the decision, Mrs. Peterson, the clerk, managed to slip a note to Officer Johnson. He read it quickly, his eyes widening as he scanned its contents. He took a step forward, holding the note in his hand. "Your Honor, if I may." "Not now, Officer Johnson," Judge Harrison replied, without looking up. He continued scribbling notes, oblivious to the growing tension around him. Officer Johnson hesitated, looking at the judge, and then glanced down at the note in his hand. The clerk's note contained a small but significant piece of information. Dr. Michelle Richardson was the wife of Mayor James Richardson and had been the chief pediatric surgeon at Cedar Grove Children's Hospital, where she had recently saved the life of Officer Bennett's daughter. Officer Johnson, who had been involved in that case, knew the significance of this. But Judge Harrison seemed uninterested. "Dr. Richardson, your cavalier attitude toward traffic laws and your attempt to use your alleged profession as an excuse is concerning," the judge continued, his voice harsh. "You may think you are above the law, but this court is here to remind you that no one is." The gallery shifted uncomfortably. People had seen the judge act this way before, but there was something different today. Even the young district attorney in turn, who had been observing the proceedings with a notebook in hand, had begun to take note of the judge's behavior. She scribbled rapidly in her notebook, her face a picture of concern as she observed the way Michelle was being treated. The morning sun had shifted, and the courtroom seemed to grow warmer. The tension was palpable, and Dr. Richardson could feel the sweat beginning to bead on her forehead as she maintained her calm. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite her growing disbelief, "I will appeal this fine. It seems excessive, especially for a first-time offense." Judge Harrison's face turned crimson, his temper flaring. "Are you questioning this court's authority, Dr. Richardson?" he barked. "Perhaps you'd like to add contempt of court to your charges." Officer Johnson took another step forward, his hand still clutching the note from Mrs. Peterson. "Your Honor, please, there's something you should." "Officer Johnson," the judge snapped, his voice like a whip. "One more interruption, and you'll be cited for disrupting court proceedings." The atmosphere in the room grew even more tense. Some of the spectators whispered to one another, and a few even pulled out their phones, capturing the drama unfolding before them. The rules of the court prohibited recording, but it seemed that no one cared to follow them in the heat of the moment. Dr. Richardson stood tall, her composure unbroken. She was a woman used to making difficult decisions under pressure, and this situation was no different. "Your Honor, I would like it noted for the record that this fine appears to be punitive and potentially discriminatory," she said firmly, her eyes never leaving the judge's face. Judge Harrison, now fuming, slammed his gavel down with such force that several people in the courtroom jumped in their seats. $1000, he declared. "Would you like to try for a higher amount, Dr. Richardson?" The young DA intern's pen moved furiously across her notepad, her concern mounting. She looked up at her supervisor, who gave her a small nod to continue documenting everything that was happening. Michelle's heart pounded in her chest as she considered her options. She had never been treated with such disregard before, but she refused to let it break her. With a steady hand, she reached into her bag and pulled out her checkbook. The room fell silent as she wrote the check, her hand steady despite the injustice of the moment. When she finished, she held it out to the judge, her dignity intact. "Will that be all, Your Honor?" she asked quietly. Judge Harrison snatched the check from her hand, his face still flushed with anger. "Yes, you may go," he said dismissively. "And let this be a lesson about respecting the law and this court's authority." As Michelle turned to leave, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had paid the fine, but she knew that the fight was far from over. The courtroom was still buzzing with whispers when Officer Johnson finally managed to get close enough to place Mrs. Peterson's note on the judge's bench. The judge glanced down at it dismissively, but as he read the words written in neat handwriting, his face changed color, draining from crimson to an almost ghostly white. The note contained a crucial detail. *Dr. Michelle Richardson is Mayor James Richardson's wife. She is the chief pediatric surgeon who saved Officer Bennett's daughter last month, asterisk. Judge Harrison's hands began to tremble slightly as he looked up at Michelle, but she was already walking out the door. The room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, but Michelle's mind was already on her next steps. As she pulled open the heavy wooden doors, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from James. "How did traffic court go, honey?" Michelle paused for a moment before replying, her fingers steady as she typed. Asterisk, "I'll tell you later, love." "I'm okay, asterisk." But deep down, she knew this story wasn't over yet. The hallway outside the courthouse was busy, but Dr. Michelle Richardson found herself standing alone for a moment, looking at her phone. The text messages flooding in were a mixture of support and disbelief, but she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. What had happened inside Judge Harrison's courtroom had escalated beyond a simple traffic violation. It was now a question of fairness, justice, and the treatment of individuals by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Michelle knew that this wouldn't end with just her case. The ramifications would echo throughout Cedar Grove. This wasn't about a rolling stop at a quiet intersection. It was about something much bigger. As she stood there, her thoughts turned to the reactions that would inevitably spread. The story of what had transpired in the courtroom was already making waves. Michelle could already imagine the conversations taking place at City Hall, where her husband, Mayor James Richardson, was in the middle of a budget meeting. He was a man of control, of steady resolve, but Michelle knew him well enough to know that his calm exterior often masked the fierce protector that lay within. As the messages continued to pour in, she felt a sense of unease settle over her. This was no longer just about her. This was about the community, the citizens who had been subjected to unfair treatment, and about how the system might be far more broken than she had ever realized. At City Hall, James sat at the head of a table surrounded by fellow city officials. The mood was tense. It was budget season, and there were tough decisions to be made. As he reviewed documents, his secretary, Linda, burst into the room, her face pale and anxious. "Mayor, there's a situation," she said breathlessly, handing him a stack of papers. James's face remained calm as he scanned the text messages on his phone, each one detailing what had happened in the courthouse. His jaw tightened with every new piece of information, his eyes narrowing as he processed the significance of the events. Judge Harrison's actions had crossed a line, and it was clear that Michelle's case was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern of discriminatory practices. James stood slowly, his composure unshaken, though those around him could see the subtle clench of his jaw. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but firm, "we'll need to continue this meeting another time." His eyes flicked briefly to his colleagues, many of whom exchanged knowing glances. They had all heard about Judge Harrison's reputation, but this was something they hadn't anticipated. As the others began to gather their papers, James moved out of the room, already focused on what needed to be done. His phone was already in his hand, and the message was clear. This would not go unaddressed. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers, his hands shaking as he poured his third glass of water. The events of the morning played on a loop in his mind, each replayed moment making him more agitated. What had he done? What had possessed him to treat Michelle with such disregard? As he stared at the check from Dr. Richardson lying mockingly on his desk, the weight of his actions hit him. He had crossed a line he had never even considered crossing before. His decisions were supposed to be based on fairness, on the law. Yet here he was, having acted out of spite and personal bias. He could feel the sweat on his brow as he loosened his tie, his breath shallow as he tried to process the weight of what had just occurred. Mrs. Peterson, the court clerk, had canceled the rest of the morning's cases citing technical difficulties with the court system. It was a half-hearted excuse, and everyone in the courthouse knew it. What had happened in Harrison's court had made waves beyond just the people inside the room. Officer Johnson had tried to warn the judge, tried to intervene before things went too far, but Harrison had dismissed him, his focus laser-sharp on the doctor who had dared to challenge his authority. Johnson shook his head as he spoke quietly with Mrs. Peterson outside the chambers. "I tried to tell him," he muttered. "I tried to tell him who she was." Mrs. Peterson nodded, pressing her lips together in a thin line. "It shouldn't matter who she's married to," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But did you see how he treated that college kid earlier? A warning for speeding, and Dr. Richardson gets a $1,000 fine for a rolling stop." She shook her head in disbelief. "It's not right." Down the hall, the young district attorney intern, Sarah Chin, sat at her desk typing up her report from the morning's proceedings. She had been silently observing Judge Harrison's courtroom for months now, and what she had witnessed today was the culmination of what she had long suspected. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she documented every detail of the morning's events, knowing that this was a moment that couldn't be ignored. She had already spoken with her supervisor about what she had seen, and now she was officially filing her report. It wasn't just about Michelle Richardson. It was about the systemic issues that had become all too apparent. The behavior displayed by Judge Harrison was a pattern, one that Sarah had seen time and time again. It was discriminatory, unjust, and it needed to be addressed. At Cedar Grove Children's Hospital, Dr. Thompson, the chief of surgery, watched a video of the courtroom incident shared by some of the courthouse visitors. He felt a rising anger in his chest as he saw the way Michelle had been humiliated. "She operated for 6 hours last night to save that boy's life," he muttered to no one in particular. "And this is how our justice system treats her?" The video had gone viral, and the anger that followed was palpable. Doctors and nurses alike gathered around their phones during their lunch breaks, watching the clips and discussing the injustice they had just witnessed. They couldn't believe what had happened, and many of them, like Dr. Thompson, felt compelled to stand in solidarity with Michelle. She had been treated unfairly, and they weren't going to stand by quietly while it happened. Back at City Hall, James sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of court records. His desk was normally neat and organized, but today it was covered in papers, each one telling the story of Judge Harrison's decisions over the last 5 years. As he combed through the files, the patterns began to emerge, undeniable and troubling. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. He turned to his city attorney, Marcus Wells, who was standing by the window, reviewing yet more documents. "This is worse than we thought," James said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had uncovered. "Look at this," Marcus replied, pulling out a particular file. "Last month, 2 speeding tickets on the same street. A white teenager got a warning. A black college student got a $500 fine." James's expression grew darker with each new document. "Over the past year," he said, his voice breaking slightly, 600 cases. The average fine for white defendants is $120. The average for minorities? $475. He placed the papers down carefully, though his hands trembled slightly. It was clear that Judge Harrison's court was not a place of equal treatment. His bias was evident in every decision. A knock at the door interrupted the silence, and Sarah Chin entered, holding a stack of documents in her hands. "Mayor Richardson," she said nervously but with determination, "I have my complete report from this morning, plus 3 months of similar observations from Judge Harrison's courtroom." James gestured for her to sit, his mind already working through the next steps. "Tell me everything you saw, Miss Chun," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "And don't leave out any details." As Sarah began recounting the events she had witnessed, Michelle's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Dr. Thompson. "Asterisk, the boy you operated on last night is awake and doing well. His parents are asking about you. They saw the courthouse video, asterisk." Michelle felt a surge of emotion. Despite the injustice she had faced, knowing that the child she had worked so hard to save was doing well brought her a moment of peace. But as she read the message, she realized the true scope of what was happening. The courthouse video, despite the strict rules against recording, had gone viral. Cedar Grove was trending on Twitter, and national news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. It had become a national conversation. Michelle spoke up, interrupting Sarah's report. "This isn't just about me or the fine," she said, her voice steady but resolute. "This is about everyone who couldn't fight back, everyone who's been treated this way in that courtroom. It's about the system that's failed them." The mayor nodded, standing up from his desk and pacing his office. "Marcus," he said, his voice filled with determination. "What are our options here?" Marcus adjusted his glasses, a steely look in his eye. "We have enough evidence to request a state investigation into discriminatory practices," he said. "The numbers alone are damning. And today's incident, the viral videos, Miss Chen's documentation, it's more than enough to get the state involved." Just then, another knock came at the door, signaling that the next phase of this fight was about to begin. The stage was set for change in Cedar Grove, and it had all started with a simple rolling stop, a small moment that had rippled out to expose the deep flaws within the system. It was no longer just about Michelle. It was about justice. It was about fairness. And it was about time for change. Mrs. Peterson and Officer Johnson arrived at City Hall, carrying more files from the courthouse. As they entered, they looked exhausted but resolute. The weight of the evidence they were bringing was clear. These were records they had kept for months, times when they had tried to intervene, cases where the fines imposed had been excessively high, and the kind of injustice they had witnessed firsthand in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Mrs. Peterson's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, her words heavy with emotion. "Mayor Richardson," she began, "we've been keeping our own records. Times when we tried to step in, and cases where the fines just didn't make sense." She handed over a thick stack of files, and James Richardson, the mayor, looked at the growing mountain of evidence in front of him. Each page was another instance of disparity, another case of discrimination, and the sheer volume of it left him speechless for a moment. James glanced up at his wife, Michelle, who had been quietly observing from a chair near his desk. They exchanged a brief, knowing look, one that didn't require words. The weight of the situation was clear to both of them. They had discussed this earlier over lunch. This wasn't just about fixing one wrong. It wasn't even just about the systemic flaws in the court that had harmed so many people for years. This was about something much bigger. It was about doing what was right. With a small nod from Michelle, James stood up, his face a mask of determination. He picked up the phone and dialed his secretary. "Get me the governor's office," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning." There was no time to waste. The story was already growing, and they needed to act quickly before the damage spread even further. Meanwhile, across town in Judge Harrison's home, the scene was far less composed. Judge Harrison sat in his living room, his mind racing as he watched the news coverage unfold on television. His phone had not stopped ringing since the story broke, and it seemed like everyone, reporters, colleagues, even old friends, wanted to hear his side of the story. But Harrison had turned his phone off an hour ago. He didn't want to hear any more. His career, built over 25 years of sitting on the bench, was crumbling in real time. His wife, Margaret, entered the room, carrying a cup of tea. She set it down on the table in front of him and spoke softly, her voice filled with a mixture of concern and exhaustion. "Bill," she said, "maybe it's time to consider retirement." Harrison shook his head, the frustration clear in his eyes. "Retirement," he muttered bitterly. "I was just doing my job. I was just maintaining order. This isn't fair." But as he spoke the words, he knew deep down that something had gone terribly wrong. This wasn't just about one moment. This wasn't just about one case. The cracks had been there all along, and now they were coming into full view. The weight of it all settled over him as he stared at the television screen, watching his life's work unravel in front of him. Back at City Hall, the team was working late into the evening, trying to gather every shred of evidence they could. Sarah Chun, the district attorney intern, had not gone home. She had worked through the night, tirelessly organizing records and piecing together patterns that had long gone unnoticed. Her desk was cluttered with sticky notes, empty coffee cups, and a collection of case files. She was determined to uncover the full extent of the corruption in Judge Harrison's court, and as the night wore on, it became clear just how deep the issue ran. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to her computer screen. Every Wednesday, when Judge Harrison knew that college students would be coming in for parking tickets, the fines for white students averaged about $50. But minority students? They paid an average of $350 for the exact same violation. She shook her head in disbelief, but Michelle, who had been sitting nearby, only nodded in grim understanding. She had known that things were wrong, but the numbers, cold and irrefutable, made it all the more real. Michelle made a few quick notes on her notepad, her mind already racing with the implications of what they were uncovering. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the message. It was from the hospital. "Dr. Richardson," it read, "your patients are asking about you. They've seen the news. Even the kids want to know if their favorite doctor is okay." The message made Michelle pause for a moment. Despite everything, she still had patients to care for, and she realized that her actions today, her role in this unfolding drama, would have consequences far beyond the courthouse. But there was no going back now. As she sat back in her chair, thinking of all the people who had been unfairly treated by the court, her resolve only grew stronger. She was doing this for them. Down the hall, James was preparing for the press conference. He and Marcus Wells, the city attorney, had spent hours crafting a statement that would address the situation without being seen as vengeful. It was a fine line to walk, but James knew that the truth had to be told. "The reporters are going to ask if this is personal," Marcus warned, as he adjusted the mayor's tie. Because of what happened to Michelle, James glanced at his reflection in the window, taking a deep breath. "It became personal the moment we realized how many families had been hurt by this," he replied, his voice firm. "But it's not about revenge. It's about justice." As the press conference loomed, the tension continued to build across the city. In Judge Harrison's house, news vans surrounded the property, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. Inside, Harrison sat in his study, his face pale and drawn as he watched the news coverage. The media circus was in full swing, and as he watched local stations interview people who had appeared in his courtroom over the years, the anger and resentment toward him only grew. One elderly black man, his voice shaking with emotion, told a reporter, "He made my grandmother cry. She was 75 years old. She got a ticket for parking slightly over the line at the grocery store. The fine was $400. She had to choose between paying that and buying her medicine that month." Harrison's face grew red as he listened to the stories of other people who had suffered similar injustices. This wasn't just one isolated incident. It wasn't just about Michelle Richardson. This was about years of unchecked power, years of discrimination, and years of lives ruined by one man's decisions from the bench. Back at City Hall, Officer Johnson and Mrs. Peterson arrived once again with more files. They were clearly tired, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, but they were determined to continue their work. Mrs. Peterson handed a thick folder to Sarah Chen, and with a weary but steady voice, she said, "We found records going back 7 years. The pattern was there all along. We just didn't have the power to do anything about it." The files piled up on Sarah's desk, each one a reminder of how long this problem had festered. At 10 a.m. sharp, the press conference began. Mayor Richardson stepped out to face the cameras, his posture straight and his expression calm. Michelle stood slightly behind him, flanked by Sarah Chun, Marcus Wells, and other city officials. The crowd of reporters grew quiet as James approached the podium, ready to address the people of Cedar Grove. "Good morning," James began, his voice steady and controlled. "Yesterday, many of you witnessed or heard about an incident in our municipal court that has raised serious concerns about the fair administration of justice in Cedar Grove." The cameras flashed as he continued, his words cutting through the tension in the air. What happened to Dr. Richardson was not an isolated incident. Thanks to dedicated city employees and concerned citizens, we have uncovered evidence of a systematic pattern of discriminatory practices spanning several years. Inside Judge Harrison's study, he sat with clenched fists, watching the press conference unfold on TV. His hands shook as he poured another drink, his mind racing with thoughts of how everything had spiraled out of control. His wife had taken their children to her sister's house to escape the media frenzy. Harrison muttered to himself, "This isn't fair. One incident, and they're destroying my whole career." But the truth was, it wasn't just one incident. It was years of injustice, and now the people were demanding accountability. As James continued his speech, Sarah Chen's phone kept buzzing with new emails. People were sharing their stories, stories of how they had been wronged in Harrison's courtroom, college students who had to drop out because they couldn't pay excessive fines, single mothers who had to work extra shifts to cover penalties for minor violations, elderly people who had to skip meals just to pay court costs. The stories kept coming in, and each one was a testament to the widespread harm Harrison's actions had caused. Michelle, standing at the edge of the crowd, noticed a group gathering with handmade signs. The signs displayed the amounts of the fines they had been forced to pay under Judge Harrison's court. Their presence was a powerful symbol. This wasn't just about one judge or one incident. This was about years of unchecked power, years of inequality, and years of fear. The people had finally found their voices. And therefore, Mayor Richardson continued, his voice rising with conviction, I am formally requesting a full state investigation into our municipal court system. Additionally, we are establishing a review board to examine all fines imposed in the past 7 years, with the goal of identifying and correcting unjust penalties. The cameras flashed once again, and reporters shouted questions, but Michelle wasn't listening. She wasn't looking at the cameras. Instead, she was watching the people in the crowd, their eyes filled with hope. For the first time in years, they felt like someone was finally listening. The wheels of justice were turning in Cedar Grove. This time, however, they were turning toward real change. The story of Cedar Grove, a small city that had long been under the shadow of one man's unchecked power, had now captured national attention. The state investigation team had set up temporary offices in the East Wing of City Hall, where the mayor, James Richardson, and his team continued to sift through the overwhelming volume of evidence. Meanwhile, Michelle Richardson, who had once been a trusted doctor, now found herself playing a pivotal role in the unfolding battle for justice in their community. She had become the face of a movement that was demanding accountability for the corrupt practices that had harmed so many people. Michelle sat in a packed community center one evening, listening to the stories of those who had been affected by the harsh fines imposed by Judge Harrison. The room was filled with people, each standing along the walls, waiting for their turn to speak. Volunteer lawyers were sitting at tables, helping people fill out forms to appeal the fines that had been imposed unfairly. The stories came pouring in, each one a reminder of the pain and hardship that so many had faced in the court system. One elderly woman spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. He charged me $800 for a broken tail light, she said, tears streaming down her face. I had to sell my wedding ring to pay it. Michelle's heart broke as she reached out to hold the woman's hand, offering comfort as Sarah Chen, now promoted to lead investigator, carefully documented her story. Sarah had become an invaluable part of the team, her dedication to uncovering the truth evident in everything she did. She listened intently as people shared their experiences, knowing that each story added to the mountain of evidence they were building against Judge Harrison. Across town, Judge Harrison faced his own reckoning. The once proud judge sat alone at a large table in a stark, sterile room, surrounded by 5 members of the State Judicial Review Board. The atmosphere was tense as they reviewed his cases, each one a damning example of his bias and disregard for justice. The board chairman, a stern-faced man with glasses perched on his nose, spoke first, his voice cold and professional. We have found that, in the past 7 years, you imposed fines on minority defendants that were on average 400% higher than those given to white defendants for identical offenses. How do you explain this? Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face flushed with a mixture of guilt and defiance. I was maintaining order, he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. The fines were meant to ensure compliance with the laws, but his justification didn't hold water. The board member across from him held up a specific case file, showing how Harrison had fined a black teenager $500 for jaywalking while giving a white teenager a warning for the same offense. The contrast was stark, and Harrison's explanation rang hollow. Meanwhile, back at Cedar Grove Children's Hospital, Michelle had returned to her surgical duties. As she walked through the pediatric ward, she was greeted differently now. Parents and children alike recognized her not just as their doctor, but as someone who had stood up against the system and refused to accept injustice. The change in how people viewed her was profound, and Michelle couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride for the work she had done. One day, as she passed by a young patient recovering from appendix surgery, Michelle heard a voice call out, "Dr. Richardson." It was Tommy, a boy who had been in her care just a few days earlier. He smiled as he sat up in his bed. "I saw you on TV," he said excitedly. "My mom says you're helping people who got treated unfairly." Michelle smiled warmly and checked his vital signs before responding. "Sometimes, Tommy," she said softly, "medicine isn't just about healing bodies. Sometimes, we need to help heal our community, too." The words felt heavier than ever as she spoke them, but she knew they were true. The fight for justice wasn't just about the cases they were reviewing or the finds they were uncovering. It was about creating a community where people could feel safe, heard, and valued. Back at City Hall, Mayor Richardson and his team were facing a staggering amount of evidence. Over 2,000 cases had been identified for review, each one an example of the systemic injustice that had plagued the city for years. The total amount of excessive fines collected over the past 7 years had exceeded $1.5 million. As the numbers were laid out before him, James looked at the spreadsheets with a mix of determination and disbelief. "We need to make this right," he said firmly, his eyes scanning the data. "Every penny needs to be returned, with interest." The ceremony continued as Mrs. Peterson, who had overseen the court's transformation, spoke about the changes inside the courthouse. "The most beautiful change," she said, "is what happens inside these courts now. Defendants are treated with respect. Fines are fair and based on ability to pay. Payment plans are available for those in need." The crowd listened intently, knowing that the work they had done together was changing lives for the better. The ceremony paused as a group of law students from Cedar Grove University released 100 white doves into the sky. Each dove represented a family that had recovered their home or business after receiving refunds from Harrison's excessive fines. The symbolism was powerful, representing both the freedom these families had regained and the healing that was taking place in the community. Michelle was asked to speak next. As she walked to the podium, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I never wanted to be a symbol," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I just wanted justice. But sometimes, fighting for yourself means fighting for everyone." She told the crowd about her latest project, a free medical clinic for families still recovering from years of unfair fines. Local doctors had volunteered their time, inspired by Michelle's example of combining professional success with community service. James, who had just seen his own initiative, the Fair Justice Act, adopted by the state legislature, stood proudly beside his wife. The act required all courts to follow Cedar Grove's new standards of transparency and equality. The ripple effects of their work were being felt far and wide, and the future looked brighter than ever for Cedar Grove. As the ceremony came to a close, a reporter asked Mrs. Peterson about Judge Harrison's current whereabouts. "That's not what matters," she replied firmly. "What matters is what we built from the ruins of his injustice." Michelle and James walked through the courthouse halls, admiring the new artwork that lined the walls. The paintings, created by local schoolchildren, depicted their visions of fairness and justice. In the main lobby, a simple plaque told the story of Cedar Grove's transformation. Outside, families lingered on the courthouse steps, taking pictures and sharing stories. The fear that had once haunted these steps had been replaced by hope. Children played where people once trembled, and laughter echoed where tears had fallen. As they stood together, watching the scene unfold before them, Michelle turned to James and said, "You know what's most amazing? It's not just about fixing the past. It's about building a better future." The sun reached its highest point over Cedar Grove, casting its light on the faces full of pride and purpose. The city had done more than expose injustice. It had shown how to heal from it, learn from it, and grow stronger. And somewhere in the crowd, a young girl looked up at the new courthouse sign, a smile spreading across her face. She knew she would never have to fear walking through those doors again. In Cedar Grove, justice had finally become colorblind. The end.